Okay, we're going to get started again. Our next panel is on politics, business, and energy policy in Russia. We're here at Rice University, and it's a regular class day, so I'm going to ask Dr. Stoll to make his presentations, and then he'll take a few questions, and then he's going to need to depart to go instruct his Rice undergraduates. And then we'll proceed with the presentation by Dr. Martha Alcott and Dr. Nina Pusenkova, ending the session with comments and thoughts by Dr. Robert Ebel. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Richard Stoll. He is a professor in our Department of Political Science here at Rice and the Associate Dean of Social Science and former Associate Director of the Baker Institute. So it's a great pleasure to introduce him.
Thank you. I apologize. Monday is actually the worst day of the week for me between meetings and teaching. And actually, I was hoping that maybe we could hold off the questions and then I could just leave and I'd never have to answer any questions on my study. But I guess that's not to be. This is actually part of a larger research project that I am engaged in with my colleague Devika Subramanian from the Computer Science Department here at Rice. And what the goal of the research project is to try to extract what are called events data from online media sources, and I'll explain in a little bit what events data are, and then use these data along with other things to predict the outbreak of international conflict. And this is a multi-year grant and a multi-year study we're working on, and we thought it might be interesting to take a look at Saudi Arabia's interactions with the United States, Russia, and China for the time period 1966-1969. We did not choose that time period. It chose us. That's the limit of the data that we have access to. And basically, we're going to look at events data during that time period, and we're going to try to determine what sort of behaviors influence Saudi behavior during that time period, and then something about the level of Saudi activity vis-a-vis the other three countries. So that's what we're trying to do. Okay, so what are events data? It's a very simple form of data in which basically you have an actor, that is the thing, usually a country, that initiates the action. The event is the kind of action, the target is the state or other actor that the event was directed to, and the date under which the event took place. Usually, with most events data schemes, there is also associated a conflict and cooperation scale that associates a score, positive or negative, with each event type. There are a number of these things out there, a number of event data schemes. We are using one called WISE, the World Event Interaction Survey, and it has over 100 different kinds of events in it. In the old days, events were coded by hand. You hired up an army of graduate students and undergraduate students and had them read the New York Times or whatever your source was, and they sit there and code and code and code. And the problem with that was it was very obviously labor intensive and very expensive, and when the big grant funding ran out for those data projects, the data collection ended. And if you're going to use human coders, again, you're going to need a ton of money, much more money than your average political scientist is going to wheedle out of the National Science Foundation. Now, the good news is, in recent years, there have been a number of advances so that we have, on the one hand, as you probably all know, because you probably all check this yourself, a number of media outlets are online now, and they not only have today's news and yesterday's news, but in a number of cases, archives stretching back in time. So the data are now accessible, the raw news stories are accessible online in a number of cases. At the same time, there have been advances in computer science and in other fields that make it more feasible. I won't say it's simple, I won't say it's easy, but more feasible to automate the process of collecting the data so that you can use a computer program rather than hire up an army of coders. We are not yet at the point, in my opinion, where, say, a single researcher, be he or she an academic or whatever, an analyst, can sit there and collect their own data and then go analyze it. We are, I think, a few years away from that, and that's one of the things my colleague and I are trying to deal with. Now, let me, in order to maximize the time period that we could study, we used the original hand-coded, WISE data, which runs from 1966 through 1978. And there's a computer, not our data, but somebody else's data, collected by computer from 1979 through the end of 1999. Unfortunately, and I don't quite understand this, but the data actually do not start until April 15th of 1979. So we have a gap. The sort of the first quarter year of 1979 is missing from our data set. Let me say a few words about problems that you can have with events data. If you use human coders, people make mistakes. People get tired, people get bored, they miscode things, maybe they miss things. The computer, the good news is the computer doesn't get tired, but given the program that you have written to extract data, maybe the computer doesn't correctly code things. Some computer programs, for example, have great difficulty extracting events from sentences. I hate to take you back to English here, but with passive voice, for example. That's a problem. You can have problems, of course, that the media source or sources that you are using are incomplete. They simply aren't reporting all the events that are truly taking place out there. Whenever I talk about this, usually the first question I get about source coverage has to do with the bias of the source. And obviously that can be an issue. I tend to think, compared to the other problems, tend to incomplete. For example, as somebody pointed out, Reuters has one correspondent who's responsible for, say, 4 different countries in Africa. And what happens if that correspondent gets sick or goes on vacation or whatever? And basically what happens is there are no stories reported in Reuters for those 4 countries, okay? So that's a problem. Bias, I actually think, is a little less of a problem. Imagine, if you will, that there's an American airstrike in Iraq today, which is probably not imagination, it probably does happen. And imagine watching Fox News and watching Al Jazeera, okay? Now, I think we would suspect that that event would be characterized in fundamentally different ways on those 2 news sources. But as long as it's reported as an airstrike, you get the event, okay? So yes, sources, the news media can make up things, etc. But most of what we think of as bias has less to do when reporting or not reporting of events, which is a problem, and more to do with how it's characterized. And all we care about is the event itself. And we take that event type and say, this is extremely hostile or extremely cooperative. We don't require that the news source characterize it in that way. So bias is probably not as big a problem as some of the other issues. Okay. Now, how do you go about and analyze this? Well, the standard way, when you have a group of countries with events data to look at the interactions, is something called vector autoregression. And I'm not going to say much about that. We discussed it a little bit in the paper. Suffice it to say, if you're having trouble sleeping at night, please give me a call and I will explain vector autoregression to you and you won't have any trouble sleeping. But very briefly, what we do is for every pair of countries, and we've got obviously 4 countries total here, we predict the events A initiates against B and the events B initiates against A, so that's 2 equations, from sort of the lagged behavior of all possible pairs. So you get this. It's a good way to get rid of forests is to do vector autoregression because the output is pretty long and extensive. But basically, we're trying to predict, and we're going to focus in on Saudi behavior towards the United States and towards Russia. We didn't do it towards China because particularly in the early years of the events data collection, and reflecting probably at least something of the reality, there wasn't much interaction between Saudi Arabia and China, okay? So we're going to use the past behavior of all these pairs to predict current Saudi behavior. We actually aggregate the events data up to 2-week time periods. And we also have, we put in some what we think are at least likely to have been critical events that may well have affected Saudi behavior. So the 6-day war, the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq war, the oil embargo, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the end of the Cold War, and a couple others. Okay, so what do we find? Well, what we find is in the pre-embargo era, pre-oil embargo era, Saudi Arabia basically was friendly to the United States if Russia was hostile towards Saudi Arabia, and the reverse relationship as well. In other words, the way we characterized it, and I'm sure there are people that know, I know there are people out in the audience who know much more about Saudi Arabia than I do, but it seemed to us that the behavior was reminiscent of that the Saudis would do what they want to do, maybe not be particularly friendly to the United States. But if Russia exhibited hostile behavior towards Saudi Arabia, they would sort of run to the United States for protection. Conversely, Saudi Arabia was friendly to Russia in the pre-embargo period if the United States and Russia were basically friendly to each other. Okay? Now, after the embargo, and we ran this analysis separately, one just everything after the oil embargo, another everything after the end of the Cold War, and the results of those two breaks are somewhat similar. We see that the things that drive Saudi behavior become more complicated. That Saudi behavior to the United States, first of all, it's unbelievably enough, they get a lot more friendly immediately after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Not exactly a stunning discovery. Basically, Saudi behavior to the United States reflects U.S. behavior towards Russia. When U.S. and Russia when the U.S. behaves positively towards Russia, Saudi Arabia behaves positively towards the United States. U.S. behaves negatively towards Russia, Saudi Arabia is negative towards the United States. And what we see in both the post-embargo and more particularly the post-Cold War period is the influence of China on Saudi Arabia is very similar to what Russia's influence was on Saudi prior to the embargo. That is, when China is friendly towards Saudi Arabia is not that friendly towards the United States. But when China exhibits hostility towards Saudi Arabia is friendly towards the United States. As far as Saudi behavior towards Russia, it is friendlier overall in the post-Cold War period, which you would expect, I think. It is also, there seems to be sort of a three-way sort of interaction between Russia, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. They're either all being friendly together or all being hostile to one another. Okay? So that's what we think, at least briefly, drives Saudi Arabia behavior towards the U.S. and Russia. Now, we also wanted to look at sort of the level of Saudi activity. Are they engaged in more activity through time or less activity? And how does their relationships within vis-a-vis Russia, China, and the United States change? And we decided to use a technique called hubs and authorities. And again, I can say the word eigenvector and things like that. But essentially, this is a technique that is very popular right now for determining important websites. Okay? That is, and a hub is a website with a link to a lot of important websites. An authority is a website that has links to it from a lot of important websites, okay? And so what we said was, well, okay, we can use those same two concepts and talk about a hub being a country to which a lot of important behavior is directed, and that a hub being a country that directs a lot of behavior to important actors, and an authority being a country that has a lot of important behavior directed to it. And we decided, since this is a relatively new technology, to just do something extremely simple. And what we asked ourselves was, look, and I also want to stress that all of the events data we use in this time period, and we're only doing 79 through 99, is coded from stories about the Middle East. So if there's a story about the Middle East that references an event between the United States and China, it gets coded. But there are obviously other events going on between the U.S. and China that wouldn't be referenced in these stories. But what we decided to do is this. Let's look at the sort of level of activity as measured by hubs and authority scores for Saudi Arabia versus U.S., Russia, and China, what their average score is. That is, does Saudi Arabia have more activity or less activity? And let's compare that to Saudi Arabian behavior versus other countries in the region. Okay, and when you do that, this is what you get. Okay, and I think you can see. Well, I'm just going to go over here. This line here is 1. So when you have a point above that, Saudi Arabia is more active than the average country it's being compared to, and below it's less active. What we see, and we kind of find this interesting, is that basically sort of Saudi Arabia is more active vis-a-vis the other three superpowers than it is within the region, okay? So it suggests to us, putting all of this together, that what we see through time here is Saudi Arabia becoming more active and assertive in the world, vis-a-vis the other superpowers. Saudi Arabia's behavior is driven through time by more complex things. The world is probably getting more complicated, particularly post-Cold War. That is, what are you supposed to be doing? So we just see this as a sign that Saudi Arabia is assuming a more active role in the world. And that's the end of my presentation.
Okay, Rick, do we have any questions from the audience about the presentation?
The Forest Ralph, the gas price. I just have a question that kind of along the lines of when they don't need the United States' protection, then the issue of Israel comes up, and so that begins to dominate them, but as soon as the bear comes to the door, they run back for cover from the United States and forget about Israel until it blows over. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment. Now, we didn't track their behavior towards Israel separately, and we probably should go back and do that too. I mean, I think the overall thing that you said is very consistent with what we find. We didn't specifically look at their behavior vis-a-vis Israel to nail that down, and I think we probably should go back and do that. But yeah, I agree with that interpretation.
Did you notice any underlying trends over time of the change in nature of relationship between Saudi Arabia and the U.S.? You know, a lot of people talk about the falling out of bed. I mean, do you see any change over time?
The way I interpret the data, and you have to be a little careful about this because there are fewer events in these data sets than we would like. I believe they look like they're pursuing a somewhat more independent policy. That is, they don't act as if the U.S. is quite the protector it used to be, and they are responding to a greater variety of things in the environment, which to me suggests that they're looking, prior to the oil embargo, let's say, they were looking in their region and looking to the United States. As time goes on, they look to more things in the world and respond to them. So they're sort of acting as if they have a more sophisticated view of and nuanced view of the world through time.
Okay, very good. Our next presenter is Dr. Martha Alcott from the Carnegie Endowment.
I'm not showing slides. I left this. Sorry, thank you. Which one's the mic? This little one? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I want to thank Ambassador Dirijian and Amy Jaffe for including me in the project, which has been a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot from Amy and from all the other participants in the project. It's really been a very good experience for me. I want to share with you some of the conclusions of my paper and questions that I think it leads to. I titled my paper Vladimir Putin and the Politics of Oil, and the goal of the paper is to look at changes in Russian policy towards natural resource development since Vladimir Putin took over in late 1999. And I'm going to get my water, I'm sorry. As the paper itself is available outside, I won't summarize it for you, but instead I'll focus on some of the most unusual or contentious points in it. The research that forms the core of the paper was largely completed in September 2003 and was presented here in a pre-workshop at that time. And in fact, when I was coming here and working on the talks, I landed and discovered that Mikhail Khodorkovsky had been arrested, causing me to look at my research and see whether the explanations for it were contained within. So this was really the first place that I argued, at least, what I consider to be the rational explanation for these actions. At that point, in September 2003, I concluded, and I haven't changed my mind at all, that Vladimir Putin had a clear-cut strategy for the use of Russia's natural resources, especially the use of Russia's oil and gas. There's a difference between clear-cut and implementable, and I'll talk more about that as I go on. And his intention was to serve as to have natural resources serve as an engine of economic restructuring and the reindustrialization of Russia. That he believes strongly that mineral resources were strategic assets which, if successful, were a tool of state policy that could not only change Russia's be an engine of economic development, but serve to dramatically enhance Russia's deteriorating international position. Amy made reference to Putin's dissertation. Many of the ideas are found in the dissertation which he submitted to the State Institute of Mining in St. Petersburg in 1998. Whether he wrote it or not is really irrelevant. I have no clue. I mean, I tend to doubt that somebody as busy as he was at that point wrote it. But the most important thing is that he read it and believed it. And that's in striking contrast to all the jokes about Brezhnev, who was introduced to his memoirs and had never heard of the ideas in them. So this really, I think it's really irrelevant whether Putin wrote it. These really do, I think, we have real strong evidence now, particularly to believe that he did. He strongly supports the ideas in it. And he may even have penned parts of it himself. The title of the dissertation was called Mineral Raw Materials and the Strategy for Development of Russian Economy. And in the notes of the Institute in the first issue of January 1999, he published the abstract, or a redone version of the abstract of this dissertation, and that is available in Russian. At least it was on the web at one point. I'm not sure. It's probably on the web in various languages and various forms now that people know of its existence. I have extensive portions of this piece and some analysis of it contained in this paper. Putin makes clear in his thesis that he believes, and this is a direct quote, or my translation of a direct quote, that the pro-market euphoria of the early years has to give way to a more moderated approach. I mean, this is really the key of this whole document. An approach, now I'm not quoting him any longer, an approach which has to combine the protection of private property with a clear understanding of the limitations of private property. And I talk about this in the paper, especially their limitations in the natural resource sector. My understanding of what Putin is saying, and it's based on years of Kremlinology, not just working in the oil sector, we're studying the energy sector. My understanding is that Putin sees private property in the natural resource sector as much like a form of guardianship, that those that own these assets are functioning in a sense like a board of directors for them. They're able to manage them and profit from their management during the phase that they are managing them. But they are not able to use their ownership of these assets to make choices which are defined by the state as putting national interests at risk. So whereas Putin defends the operation of a market, his notion of what a market is fundamentally different from a Western-style free market. This said, while Putin has clear-cut goals and stages and phases and lots of lists, in his thesis, and many of them turn up in his further policy pronouncements upon coming to power and in economic reports, agendas for development in the economic sector, agendas for development in the economy. Most of these statements are rather vague and sometimes even contradictory. And it's been a real challenge for Putin and the people around him to try to turn these goals into operational policies. We've begun to see some of these policies. He also faced, in the early years, he faced another challenge. So there was the challenge of making these goals operational. The second challenge was that Putin and those around him lacked the power to implement most of the policies that he believed were necessary to bring order to the natural resource sector, and to redefine the relationship of private property in this sector and the state, the relationship both of Russian private property and international actors engaged in it. For at the core, Putin was committed to the enhancement of the power of the state and reversing what he saw as the degeneration of the power of the state, a degeneration which some defined as democratization. But if it was democratization, I would argue it was democratization by default rather than the commitment of a Russian political environment to create a democratic system. And he sought, as he's gone about strengthening his power, and I don't have time to go through all the different ways, he has sought to do this at the very time when he has to deliver political payoffs to the people who are helping him make these changes. So in bringing in a new group of actors to secure his system, he also has to pay them off. I mean, he has to deliver political goods and economic goods to them to compensate them for their support. I mean, this is like the post-Soviet world, which leans heavily on the Soviet world. Okay, now with this context, let me turn to the events of the last 18 months and what I would argue is in the last 18 months, developments in two arenas began to intersect. But we see around the whole affair of Yukos and Khodorkovsky, they didn't simply cross, they collided. Okay? First, we have in the run-up to the 2003 parliamentary elections and 2004 presidential elections, and now, everybody thinks that whatever agreement was made with the Yeltsin family began to expire, that it was to hold for 4 years, and that period was over. So this was a period that we should have expected change. Okay, so we see the evolution of the political system. Putin understood it was one crack. He had these two elections to redefine the political system so that it could function in a way he wanted to implement other changes in the whole shift in where power lay. And I'll talk about some of those changes as I go on. Okay. Second, it was at this same time that Putin finally began to get the power necessary to assert more control of national resources, and especially to assert control in the oil and gas sector. And the timing of this is really critical because the further along private ownership went in the natural resource sector, the more deeply entrenched partnerships were with Western firms, projects that went from exploration to firm roots or into exploitation are harder to modify. So he understood that there was a real window here too if he was going to modify policy. And I would argue that for a lot of different reasons, some of which are in the paper, that the drama around Yukos served as a way to bring these two together and bring them together in a way that in the end became very theatrical. And theater is really important in the Russian or the post-Soviet political environment. To do things with a lot of drama, really, it takes people's attention away from other things that are changing at the same time. And there were enormous changes going on in management of natural resources, changes in the tax structure, changes in how licensing were going on. But most of the attention, really did focus around the whole Yukos, the events around the arrest and incarceration of Khodorkovsky. As I say, it became the defining event. I would argue that the arrest itself was not necessary, but it did serve to create other political goods. And I just want to say a couple things, because I know I'll run out of time about this, just make 4 points about it. I would say that anybody, without Putin in the room, it's hard to know whether he wanted to arrest Khodorkovsky or he just simply wanted to use the arrest of the Menotep, the other officials, as a warning to change Khodorkovsky's behavior. I would say that that there's a lot of evidence that supports the second, but that doesn't mean that the first is not true. Certainly there were elements of revenge involved in all this, in targeting some of the Menotep executives. But I think that with or without Khodorkovsky's arrest, Putin was determined to change Yukos's policies, that Yukos's courting of a strategic partnership with ExxonMobil or Chevron Texaco would have changed the balance of decision-making with regard to a pipeline, an export pipeline for East Siberian oil. And that was an issue that, because of TNK ownership with BP, that he had approved of. And Putin was not about to give up control of these kinds of strategic decisions to oil companies, to private oil companies, whether they were owned by Russians or foreigners. Okay. But I would say when the first set of arrests occurred, and Khodorkovsky didn't retreat, he continued to be an active political actor. Then the question simply became not one of tax collection and license reexamination, but people in the Kremlin began to wonder whether the existence of Yukos in its current form would not continue to pose a threat to their decision-making. And most importantly, Khodorkovsky's actions in supporting democratic activists were really putting the shape of the election campaign at risk. As I've mentioned before, control of the parliament, not just electing a docile parliament, but as we see now with the newly proposed reforms, a parliament that was willing to weaken the nature of that institution and to support constitutional change that would reshape the relationship between the center and periphery, between the subjects of the Russian Federation and the center, which is critical for oil and gas development and natural resource development in many parts of Russia. That was simply, Putin could not allow any individual to pose a threat to this because it really threatened his whole game. This redefinition was announced after the Beslan tragedy, after people were killed in that school in northern Ossetia. And at that point in time, Russian theater changes, and now the local war on terror has replaced any concern about the oligarchs as the focus of where Russian political drama is. I honestly believe that the parallel of the announcement of the Russian government organization, which could be justified, although it didn't do anything for making Russia more effective in dealing with terrorists, and the reorganization of Gazprom with Rosneft on virtually the same day is not coincidental, because as people have always said to me, nothing is coincidence in that part of the world. Coincidence does occur, but I do think that there is not. In this case, I think that there are important linkages between local government reform and Russia's changing reorganization of the oil and gas sector. It will allow Putin, the new proposed reforms, and I'm getting towards the end, will allow Putin a much more effective instrument for asserting the role of the state and for regulating private firms in a way that takes some control of market conditions and some control of and takes some and also pays attention to a legal environment. To have an oil and gas system that pays attention to a legal environment, for him, was critical to change the legal environment, and that's exactly what he's proposing to do. This reorganization, and I'm coming to my concluding points, will probably take 18 to 36 months. I mean, it's not a simple thing that he proposes. We're going to see, I think, a shift of assets, some assets from UCOL, and possibly a shift of some assets on an exchange basis, on a basis of an asset swap with Gazprom between TNK-BP and Gazprom to settle some of the transportation issues. I think there's also the possibility that we will see a reorganization of the transport system in which Gazprom loses some of its transport and Transneft is redefined in order to do both gas and oil. There are evidence. This is being tried in other parts of the former Soviet Union, and it seems to be working. So I don't preclude that as like a coming down the line. I mean, I think they have opened a box of reform, and they themselves don't know where it's going to lead them, and then they will play with different options. Two concluding points. I think that $50 oil may well have sped up the timetable for the reorganization of the oil sector. Many of the calculations, all the calculations on the new export tax, which was first introduced in 2002 and then modified this year, where there's an increased tax depending upon the price of oil, were done at $25 to $35 a barrel. So the Russian government for this year and probably next year are going to get a lot more income than they anticipated, and they're poised to capture more of that income than would have been the case prior to 2002. Okay. In conclusion, all right. There has been a lot of speculation as to whether Putin's strategy for natural resource development is in fact feasible, leaving aside whether it makes Russia an irresponsible global citizen, something Amy raised in the beginning that I'm going to come back to at the very end as my final conclusion. So there's lots of speculation whether this is feasible or whether it will lead to a further decay of Russia's oil and gas industry, leaving them less domestic capital for reinvestment if oil drops back to $20 or below down the road. And that it could create, the changing legal infrastructure could, and I'm not arguing will, create such unattractive terms for Western investment that help will not be forthcoming. Much, I think, depends upon the quality of people Putin appoints in the long run to work in this sector, and whether the Siloviki, whether the people that he's bringing from national security will be short-lived or whether they will prove to be competent managers, because in the end it doesn't matter where they began their career, it matters whether they can make the shift. And it still has to be seen whether the terms on offer will be sufficiently acceptable to Western investors, and that will be partly determined not just by changes in Russia's legal infrastructure, and if they're consistent with the changes in licensing that have been announced, but also by what other opportunities are there, what are the competing opportunities for the capital. Finally, it's clear that $50 oil, at least for a year or so, has reinforced what I would argue is Vladimir Putin's preference for a go-slow approach to the natural resource sector. He understands that a non-renewable resource and non-renewable resources have to be developed slowly. I mean, that the first stage is to gain control, and then the second is to begin the process of development of these assets. This is why, and we'll talk about pipelines later today, I mean, this is why I feel strongly that no permanent decisions, no decisions on pipeline routing that lead to allocation of capital will be made while the fight over resources, while the shifting of resources is still going on. In his mind, and I don't know, how well I can climb into it, it seems to me, though, that in his mind, national interest includes figuring out how to collect and use revenue properly before you begin generating revenue. And this is what he defines as his responsibility to Russia's citizens. This leads to the last question I want to look at, or at least comment on, which is the whole question that Amy raised in the beginning. For him, for Putin, it's a question of how to balance national interests with the need of serving a global economy. This points up a question which I know is addressed in the summary that you will get to see later today, because I got to see part of it yesterday, that there is a basic tension between producers and consumers. And this tension becomes particularly clear when oil products reach where they are today. Oil producers and oil consumers often have different interests. And Russia is unlikely, by both the character of its government and by the history of those who are governing in the history of the country, to be a country that modifies its sense of national interest and gives away some of what it sees as its international advantage for the sake of improving the conditions in the consuming nations which in the mind of much of Russian public opinion and much of the Russian elite have done very little to prioritize meeting the needs of the Russian people. Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank James Baker Institute and Petroleum Energy Center for inviting me to this very challenging project and for giving me an opportunity to do what I'm most interested in. I'm absolutely helplessly fascinated by the Russian oil industry. And I have been fascinated since 1991 when I had my first trip to Siberia. Incidentally, it was to Surgut and Neftyugansk. And I met for the first time with Vladimir Bogdanov, whom we spoke about in the morning, and Mr. Muravlenko, who was then the general director of Yugansk Neftegaz. And to develop some of the ideas that were raised in the morning, I would like to quote Mr. Bogdanov. He said two things 13 years ago, and I still remember them. The first thing was, he did not want his company to fall into the hands of foreigners and criminals. That's probably a development of the xenophobic idea. And the second, he said that in a few years, his company would successfully compete with mid-sized international companies. At that time, it seemed incredible, because in 1991, the country was falling apart, oil production was declining, and it seemed like a pipe dream. But now, you will see that he quite realistically assessed his potential and potential of his own company. So since then, I have been observing with great interest the fates of different companies and different individuals, and I tried to understand what made some of them successful and why others failed. And it became increasingly clear that just production, financial, or corporate governance indicators are not enough to explain it. Probably, to a large extent, the answer lies in mysterious Slavonic soul or Russian factor or our cultural social, political, and even psychological aspects. I would call them the ephemerals in contrast to tangibles. And these ephemerals are probably going to play an increasingly important role now, when Vladimir Putin sort of gave 5 either explicit or implicit signals to the business community in general and to the oil companies in particular. So, I summarize them as 5 new commandments of doing the oil business in Russia. So first, be a good corporate citizen. To a certain extent, it seems that the government is trying to shift some sort of corporate social responsibility, some sort of social responsibility to the corporate sector, sort of lifting the burden from itself. The second one probably doesn't require an explanation. The third, be politically correct. In our context, it probably means don't meddle in politics and don't support the opposition party. It's also quite clear. Be patriotic. So probably it stems from the idea that the government would never allow foreign companies to exert a significant influence on the Russian oil sector. And the last one, be sensible about your licenses. Right now, the licensing law is getting tougher and tougher, and the government is using this lever as a very effective instrument against certain companies. And we can see that right now the state is making a very distinct differentiation between certain companies, and the state is supporting those who abide by these rules and sort of suppresses those who do not, which do not. So, and in this sense, I think it will be interesting to look at 2 companies that I chose. Surgutneftegas and Yukos. On the one hand, they are complete antipodes in many things, in their mission, vision, strategy, tactics. And on the other hand, these 2 companies are very closely associated with certain individuals. So when we say Surgut, we mean Vladimir Bogdanov, and Yukos in its current form is very much the creation of Khodorkovsky. So that takes me to this slide. So I tried to draft sort of a wheel of fortune of both companies. I mean, it's very subjective. I tried to see how these companies developed, how the companies and the fates of their bosses developed in terms of production parameters, financial parameters, corporate governance initiatives, their image. Again, it's very subjective, and you can alter the shape of the curves, but I think that in general the trend is quite fairly depicted. So Bogdanov was appointed general director of Surgut way back in 1984. He was 32 at that time. So by now he has been at the helm for 20 years. I think it's an unprecedented length of time in Russia in transition. So let's say over these years, the company and Bogdanov have been demonstrating not very rapid, but sustainable and solid growth. During the 90s, the decline of oil production on Surgut was much lower than the industry's average. Amazingly, it was an island of financial stability in the oil sector. It never had wage tax arrears, which is indeed sort of a miracle in Russia. It was doing a lot for the social sphere in the region. And to comment again on what was said in the morning about, let's say, his attitude to foreigners, he showed that he knows how to change with changing times. For example, in 1997, it was the first company, it was the 4th Russian oil issuer to enter the capital market with American depository receipts. I think it tells something about it. Then, in the early 21st century, analysts were starting to say that Surgut is getting too old-fashioned, that Bogdanov is over the hill, the company is under-reformed, and they were contrasting Surgut with Yukos and Sibneft, which was showing quite a different rate of growth. But if we look at the situation now, we will see that right now Surgut is probably stronger than ever. Recently, it acquired the Lakansk field, which was mentioned in the morning. It joined the consortium of Rosneft and Gazprom in Siberia. So, I mean, his potential is not yet fully realized. And if the company was so successful for 20 years, over 3 totally different periods in Russian history, socialism, gangster capitalism of the 90s, and right now, let's say, authoritarian capitalism, probably it means that his business model, which might not have worked anywhere else, it's quite suitable for Russian environment. Let's put it this way. And on the other hand, that's the wheel of fortune of Khodorkovsky. So he got involved in UCAS in 1995. At that time, the company was in pretty bad shape, both in terms of production and financially. And there was also mounting social tension in Neftejugansk. So Khodorkovsky put a lot of efforts in turning the company around. And during the 90s, it was not doing so well. Its production was declining and stagnating. It was consistently in the red. It gained the reputation of a bandit company because of its fights with minority shareholders that are quite well known. So, and probably the year 2000 marked a certain turning point in the history. I tried to show it here. So, on the one hand, it introduced very sophisticated production methods by entering into strategic alliance with Schlumberger. It restructured the company. He restructured the company. He improved corporate governance a lot, and many analysts sort of recognize it. And by the year 2003, the company seemed to be on top of the world. And then, after the well-known events, the wheel of fortune took a nosedive. And again, I might repeat it, that production and financial indicators do not explain why that happened, because the company was doing great in terms of nuts, bolts, and bugs. So that brings us to the question of what I said of ephemerals. There are many similarities. There are some similarities between Surgut and Yukos, between Bogdanov and Khodorkovsky. Both persons profited handsomely from the loans for shares auctions. They're both outstanding business leaders, Russian style. They were both technological leaders. Surgut was an undisputed technological leader during the 90s. It was one of the few Russian companies capable of doing its own hydrofracking and horizontal drilling. And though it didn't align with foreign companies, it bought a lot of very sophisticated foreign equipment. And, for example, did the frac jobs itself instead of inviting Schlumberger. And then in this century, probably Yukos overtook it in terms of technological edge. Also, both companies made a great contribution to the development of our science and education. And for me, as a researcher and a teacher, I think it's extremely important, and I take it very personally. I think they are doing and were doing much more than our government is doing in this sphere, to put it mildly. But probably here the similarities stop. And that takes us to differences between them. I won't go through all of them, but just probably the most telling ones. Let's say Bogdanov was developing with the times. Khodorkovsky, I think, was just a little bit ahead of the times. Surgut was developing mainly on the basis of its own reserve base in Khanty-Mansi district. And he was growing, but not too fast, and he didn't seem a threat too much of a threat, let's say, to competitors. While Yukos was growing largely on the basis of acquisitions, the company was getting bigger and bigger, and with the proposed alliance with Sibneft, it would have become so big that it would be a real threat to other players. Then, let's look at this point. Bogdanov, again, is recognized as xenophobic. He always sort of kept an arm's length relationship with foreigners. It was the only company in the oil sector of Russia that didn't establish joint ventures. And he always gave very active support to domestic producers, which also made him quite popular in this sense. And Khodorkovsky, on the other hand, was the pioneer of westernization in the sector. He invited many Western executives to the top positions in the company. He signed a strategic alliance with Schlumberger. In the board of directors, he had 7 foreigners out of 10 people, so it also tells you something. And finally, his plan to sell a big chunk of Yukos Sibneft to a foreigner, of course, seemed a considerable threat to our bureaucracy. but that was already mentioned before. Then, an interesting point, Bogdanov is sometimes called the general who walks to work. I mean, he's not exactly a poor person. He's included in the Forbes list. But he is not perceived as an oligarch. Because, again, he sort of behaves like a normal, ordinary person walking to work, sometimes buying his own groceries or spending his vacations in the village where his parents live. And it's a psychologically important aspect. And on the other hand, Khodorkovsky was always recognized as the richest man in Russia. And since envy is probably one of the most important and most unpleasant Russian natural characteristics, of course, this also played a serious role in his current predicament. So Bogdanov is and always was apolitical. So he declined the offer of Mr. Putin to become the energy minister. He never meddled in politics. But on the other hand, he showed sort of a proper etatist attitude. Well, again, I probably didn't know to go into explanations about the situation with Khodorkovsky. Also, Bogdanov minds his own business. He mainly stays in Surgut. He also earns the nickname of Surgut Recluse, and he's not a threat. He doesn't seem a threat. While political ambitions of Khodorkovsky and probably his ideas about promoting private pipelines in Russia also contributed to the current situation. And finally, Bogdanov was always very strong on social programs. And even his, let's say, rivals recognize that now Surgut is flourishing, and the social package offered in Surgutneftegas is unparalleled in the Russian oil industry. While Khodorkovsky also did a lot for the social sphere, but he made a much greater focus on enlightenment with his programs of internet education, the new civilization, with his support to the State Humanitarian University. And so probably it was also considered to be slightly ideologically incorrect. So to sum it up, I would like to return to my initial idea that to properly assess Russian companies, you have to take into account these ephemerals. And in a way, Bogdanov always remembered what kind of country he lived in. Probably that's why he succeeded, and that's why I call him the realist in my paper. And I called Khodorkovsky the romantic because at some point he simply forgot what country he lived in. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'd like to ask Bob Ebel now to come up to the podium and serve as our discussant for the morning session.
My task will be to try to read what I wrote in my scribblings this morning. You know, when I thought about the role of a discussant, I said, you know, really, you look to him to hit the highlights of what you heard. But how can I possibly summarize, you know, in the time available to me, what we did here this morning? But nevertheless, let me try. I think I boiled it down to one sentence. And this sentence will apply not only to what we have heard this morning, but to what we will hear this afternoon. And it is this: there is nothing as attractive as something that has been denied, but which is now available, especially when little else is available. I made my first visit to the Soviet Union in 1960 as a member of the first oil delegation that our government sent to that country. Well, what have I learned in the years following? When we think about the future, we should first revisit the past, if only to underscore that it will be the unknowns that will likely shape that future for us. Let's go back to 1993, for example. In 1993, China was a net exporter of oil. China today is a driver in world oil demand. In 1993, the Russian oil collapse was still underway, and we really didn't have any good idea as to when it might end. Today, Russia challenging Saudi Arabia for leadership in oil production. So that should give us some concern about the confidence level of our assessments. But having said that, it's also clear that this future will be shaped in part by answers to the question, a simple question, is it sustainable? Russian oil and gas production and exports, are they sustainable? China's growth in demand for oil, is it sustainable? OPEC production growth, is it sustainable? Normally, when we look at a country, we look at it from the outside. We look at it rarely from within. Let me give you an insight into what is going on in the Kremlin, at least as it pertains to oil, through the eyes of President Putin. President Putin arrived early, as usual, at his Kremlin office, always anxious to read his presidential morning brief. Other presidents have morning briefs, He skimmed through the pages, but one section in particular caught his attention. That section reviewed current developments in the world oil market. Escalating problems in Saudi Arabia. Oil infrastructure security was at a heightened level, but nonetheless remained vulnerable to an insider attack. World oil spare producing capacity was shrinking rapidly. Political problems in Nigeria and Venezuela still constrained oil production and exports. The handover of power in Iraq was not going well at all. Even though Libya was now open to foreign investment, any surge in output and exports this decade did not appear likely. World oil demand was continuing its robust growth, and the rise in oil prices seemingly had no end. Well, how was my oil industry doing, he wondered. Turning the page, there was his answer. Oil production was now approximating that of Saudi Arabia. And if Transneft met its goal for this year, and if exports by rail and inland waterway in the second half would match the accomplishments of the first half of the year, exports might well exceed 6.5 million barrels of oil a day. Nevertheless, still short of Saudi Arabia. The morning brief then posed this question: might Russia ever match Saudi Arabia? Short term, the prospects did not look too good, the brief said. The economic development and trade minister was quoted as stating that Russian production growth was likely to slow for the next several years, perhaps averaging 9.5 million barrels a day through 2006, 2007. A bit disappointing, perhaps, but since domestic demand was not growing very much, that meant that all incremental barrels would be available for export, probably pushing sales beyond the 7 million barrel per day limit. Thinking out loud and reflecting upon the uncertainties regarding Saudi, Venezuela, Nigerian, Iraqi, and Libyan oil, what does Russia have to offer the world oil market that these suppliers do not? What is it that our oil exports could build on? The answer, at least to Putin, was quite clear. We offer reliability. We offer security of supply. In plain language, we are not the Persian Gulf. Yes, we might play politics from time to time with deliveries to the republics of the former Soviet Union, but with only minor exception have we ever played politics with oil sales to customers in the West. And we don't cut oil sales as a way of supporting higher prices. We sell what we've got, what are surplus to our domestic needs, at whatever price prevails at the moment. That oil-derived income, our reputation as a reliable supplier, are far too important for us to ever use oil as a political tool. Could we regain our past glories? Could we return Russia to the days back in 1988, for example, when we were outproducing Saudi Arabia by millions of barrels a day? If we could do that, and if our domestic needs were not much above where they are today, why Putin thought, well, if I played my cards right in the coming years, I could be king of the oil hill. We could shift the center of oil power from Riyadh to Moscow, particularly if I could convince President Nazarbayev to coordinate his oil policies with mine. What a nice sound that phrase has, he mused, king of the oil hill. Just then, there was a knock on the door. A loud voice exclaimed, "Time to get up, Mr. President. It's 5:30 in the morning." Putin awoke with a start. His vision of the future as king of the oil hill had been nothing more than a dream. Or is it? I'll leave that question to you. Soviet oil collapse in 1987, 1988 was unprecedented. Unprecedented in world oil market history. It was unprecedented because it was caused not by war, wasn't caused by developments in the marketplace, but it was caused by oil field mismanagement and by the lack of investment capital. Today, we've been told that the capital is now available. But what about mismanagement? Are the oil fields being overproduced to take advantage of the high oil prices? While the Soviet Union was still alive, this is the way they looked at their future. Once we develop all the easy oils in West Siberia, we'll turn back to the Caspian. That's where our future is going to be. But then that future was taken away from them when the Soviet Union broke up in December 1991. Where is the future today? The future today is in East Siberia and offshore. Well, suppose that future is not realized. What happens to Soviet oil production? Or what happens if it is realized? If it's realized, we can expect probably continued growth through the middle of next decade. If it's not realized, I would suspect you see a declining in production starting, maybe in about 10 years. So we have to keep an eye on Russia's oil future, which is East Siberia and the offshore regions. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to ask Bob to sit down with Martha and Nina, and we have about 10 minutes or so for questions before we break for lunch. So I open the floor to questions for any of the panelists. You're all hungry, come on.
Yeah, I'd like to ask both of the speakers, in the world as you see it developing, how does Surgut and the new Gazprom-Rosneft combo work together? How do you feel their working relationship will be, or will there be a working relationship?
Well, they have been, this consortium has been established for a year ago. There are still no strategic plans how they would develop it. They just sort of declared their intentions that East Siberia is going to be the sphere of their strategic interests. But since these companies, let's say Gazprom, Rosneft is a state company, Gazprom is sort of getting greater and greater state influence exerted over it, and Surgut was always, as I said, a very etatist company, and Bogdanov always showed his loyalty to Putin, so there are some, let's say, common points between them. Also, an important consideration is that Surgut is probably the most cash-rich company in the Russian oil sector. So both Gazprom and Rosneft, or ultimately if it's Gazprom, they would be very interested in Surgut as cash cushion or something like that. So again, there are certain opportunities for their more or less fruitful cooperation, let's put it this way. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah,
Can I just throw one?
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the patterns we're gonna see is that in the oil projects, Gazprom will behave a lot like Rosneft, that it's just gonna take a piece of the action and will look to bigger companies and consortiums of companies to be the actual producers. And that way, I think Surgut makes a very good partner for it, because if the new Rosgasneft, or whatever they're gonna call it, doesn't have majority share of a project, but just has a strategic majority in the project, they're gonna wanna be able to rely on at least one of the partners as being willing to accept the leading intellectual role of the state in making the timetable choices, the transport choices.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you all, Dr. Gordon presented some sort of interesting ideas where a Russian oil company, realizing they have cash, having barriers for transport or other problems for investing inside Russia, turns around and wants to invest internationally. How, in the cultural scale, how do you see a company going and not just selling its sales for profit, its shares for profit, the way Yukos had proposed to do with Exxon or Chevron Texaco? How do you see the proposition of what I call an asset swap, which has always been discussed, was discussed also in the Middle East context, but has never really happened, where some oil company in the Western region, either European or American, comes to a Russian company and says, we'll give you this percentage of our stake in Nigeria or in some other location in exchange for you're giving us a piece of the following field in Russia. Do you think that would run against the grain of what Putin and his associates are trying to accomplish in the industry, or would that be looked upon favorably?
As long as it's not a controlling interest, a small interest, and as long as the government sort of approves of the company, that is workable.
I
Go ahead.
was gonna change it slightly, so why don't you go ahead and
Well, I think, if it doesn't work out that way, if that doesn't work out successfully, they'll face the same problem that all international oil companies face today. Where do you go to looking for new oil? Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, where do you go? West Africa, where do you go? Iraq, not yet. So that's the problem facing international oil companies today. Where do you go to find the oil that you're producing, to offset the oil that you're producing today? Remember the abysmal failure of the Japan National Oil Company, who spent billions of dollars looking around the world for equity oil, and they found out China's now doing the same thing, trying to develop equity oil around the world, but they're not very successful. They're finding that the pickings are pretty slim. No big deals waiting out there for China. So unless the Russian oil companies get in on the coattails of a Western partner, for example, into a deal that's already in place, they're going to have difficulty.
We have an interesting case in the natural resource sector of a variant of that, which is Norilsk Nickel owning a piece of gold fields and trying to play a decisive role in the merger of, the choice of a merger partner. And that's a case where you have export of asset, if you like, a way to try to take excess capital from the company and protect the company itself from being renationalized by becoming part of a foreign company as well. And those kinds of choices may also face the oil companies, and I'm sure the oil sector is watching with interest how this plays out.
And another alternative to a question, where to go, might be the still untapped reserves of Russia, because let's say the giant Samatlor field, it hasn't said its last word yet, because according to different estimates, there are about 1 billion tons of recoverable reserves still there. But they are in lenses, they're very hard to recover, they need sophisticated equipment, technology, and know-how. So in a way, that might be some sort of an answer to your question where to go. And also things like flaring of associated gas in Russia, which is a huge problem. Also some foreign experience and again, maybe technology and know-how could be helpful. And it will mean huge savings.
A number of the people today have touched on, but not focused much on TNK-BP and how they're going to manage to operate, particularly from the foreign involvement there in this changing environment. And I'm just curious what you all think, and if anybody else this morning wanted to comment on it. I've heard some folks venture that the Kremlin has been a little bit surprised they didn't quite get the deal they were signing into, and are trying to figure out their way forward in terms of limiting the foreign freedom to operate there. Certainly, production has been going up. It's been a successful enterprise, but there's really mixed reports. I think BP is presenting a very positive picture about what's happening there, but I think maybe their management future there as a foreign company, particularly in this environment of control, is kind of an enigma, and I'm curious about your forecasts on that.
I mean, I have some theories of what's going to happen, but I think that, you know, TNK-BP is vulnerable with their licensing and the new licensing environment because they can't perform with a Kovlivka field until the transport issues are resolved. And the transport issues are not going to be resolved unless they reach a working agreement with Gazprom. And there's been all sorts of reports in the press, you know, that there's constant discussion about this. And I think what's going to happen in the end, I think the only kind of winning formula is environment. So I can't speak to what BP's management is going to do. But I think the winning formula in this environment is going to be some form of asset swaps, diluting their ownership in fields where they are the overwhelming owner, making Gazprom a strategic partner. In return, they will get bigger pieces of things that they already have small pieces of, or small pieces of things they don't have any pieces of. And in return, there will be accommodation on the transport issue, a pipeline that I can't say that they will agree to have it owned by a foreigner, but we may see a new status in the pipeline that's of mixed status. I do think this whole question of transport is going to occupy the Kremlin, how to reform the transport part of Gazprom in a way that makes it more analogous to Transneft, if not a part of Transneft. But I see BP is able to survive, but there's going to have to be, they're going to have to be some degree of asset shifts, and they're going to have to take a reduced role on certain issues. But I think that they will be compensated for this by more property, by the ability to, that I don't see the Russian government as trying to drive them out or make their operations unprofitable. I see this as seeking accommodation on both sides, because I do think that Putin wants foreign investment, both on a project-specific way and in a way that dilutes, in a way that allows him to do asset swaps. I'm really curious to see how the ConocoPhillips share of Lukoil evolves, because I don't think they're going to be stuck with 7.6%. They're going to get pieces, big pieces of certain projects, and have very tiny pieces of other projects. And I think that's the model we're going to see under Putin. But that, of course, requires BP, TNK seeing it as in their interest.
The success of TNK BP in growth in oil production has come in large part through a revival of the Summit Laurel oil field. You followed the history of the Summit Laurel oil field, which was discovered in the 1960s, probably one of the largest finds ever made. And its production literally went from 0 to 3.5 million barrels per day overnight. And it fell just as quickly as it went up because they pulled the fields too hard, and 10 years later, for every 10 barrels of liquids brought to the surface, 9 were water. But now with BP coming in, bringing in technical know-how, managerial know-how, that oil field is being revived. And there's tremendous volumes of oil there that can be recovered with the application of new technology. So when you look at the success of TNK-BP in terms of oil production growth, think in large part Summit Laurel.
And maybe 2 comments to your question. So about TNK-BP, I think it would be extremely interesting to watch how 2 absolutely different corporate cultures sort of interact. A very, let's say, to put it mildly, aggressive culture of BP and much more traditional and conservative culture of BP. I have friends in the company, and they say that that sort of internal conflict of ideas, visions, etc., might become a certain problem in the future. It's the one thing, and another thing, probably it also should be taken into account that now when Russian companies are getting so much stronger, more confident, more sophisticated, etc., in any project with a foreign company, they will no longer be satisfied with the role of a junior partner. And that's a fact. It might seem not rather a happy news for foreigners, but it's something that has to be taken into account. That's the reality.
One more question. In next month, US neft gas will be sold. And if Sibirot neft gas has taken that, what kind of change in technology will happen? For instance, they will return back to the Russian technology?
It's an extremely interesting question, and I thought about the potential, well, how their sort of rules of fortune would converge if it happens. Again, I would want to repeat that Surgutneftegas always bought the most sophisticated Western technology. For example, it was the first company in Russia that bought coiled tubing units back in 1993. So it's not exactly Russian technology. Right now, Surgut is trying to substitute part of the imports with domestically produced equipment, again, sort of supporting the slogan of support domestic producer. But it doesn't use entirely Russian technology and know-how. Well, it's a very interesting question because many people say that, let's say, UCOS is overproducing the fields, that the very high rates of recovery lead ultimately to lower recovery, and that goes against the concepts of a more traditional, more production-oriented groups of companies like Surgut or Lukoil. I'm not an engineer, it's difficult for me to assess to what extent this statement is true. This summer I had a chance to talk to Senior Vice President of Production of UCOS, and I sort of asked him this question, and he gave me very detailed, specific answers saying that it's not true. They're not damaging the reservoirs, and let's say I believe him by 95% probably. But probably if it happens, Surgut will try to introduce sort of its concepts of field development, so denser well pattern, maybe slower rates of oil recovery. So it will, again, be more, we call UCOS and Sibneft commercially oriented companies, and Surgut and Lukoil production oriented companies. So probably it will be a more production oriented approach.
Last question over here.
Assuming the investment that we've talked about, how does return on that investment play out? Where is it, once the money goes in, is it then used locally? Are there concessions given? Are you allowed to take some money and distribute it in other parts of the world? Use of profits that was mentioned? What happens?
I guess I'll take that one. I mean, you know, I think that basically we're kind of in a transition in the sense that the companies are free to use their capital as they see fit, whether they want to use it to develop resources at home or whether they want to try for an oil field in the Caspian or someplace else. What I think we see going on, and we've had some comments on this morning, is that the Russian government is trying to sort of create an atmosphere or mechanisms where they have a lever to say, you were thinking of going abroad, we'd like to send you to Saudi Arabia, right? Instead of having the companies look around and talk to Exxon and talk to, you know, different groups and say, well, okay, I think the best exploration in the world is going to be in Angola because they have the following, you know, contract terms. There seems to be, you know, in my opinion, I don't know if you guys agree, sort of the Kremlin coming in and saying, you know, I've got certain targets for international investment that I want to make based on geopolitics, and if you're in with me, I might pick you to go and make this investment. And I think the same thing in the domestic framework. I mean, no one is going to do East Siberia until the federal government decides what the priority is, right? So I think it's sort of the same way. So within my own production areas, where nobody's worrying about my West Siberian field or so on and so forth, then the federal government is out of it. I can spend as I see fit. I can make some returns to shareholders, but just to make a radical statement, I mean, people are talking about in Russia, Rick mentioned the possibility that if I'm going to invest all my money by giving it back to dividends to shareholders, and then we're all going to go to Paris, that may not play out well in the Russian context, and therefore the Russian companies may see higher taxes. We're already hearing conversations like that here in the United States when people look at how the oil companies are being pressed by Wall Street to produce a better performance on Wall Street in a quarterly way. You've already got people on the left in the United States who are saying, well, if the money isn't being reinvested in the sector and we have shortages of oil and gas in the United States, maybe we should tax that away, right? So I don't think it might be slightly different in the Russian context, but I think Rick is correct when he says that there are going to be governments all around the world thinking about what rents they can take out of corporations that are making money in the oil and gas sector.
And can I throw in two first things? I mean, I think the question is really an interesting one. There hadn't been a tension over exporting profits to invest abroad, really, until this issue of UCOS and UCOS's agreement with China. When UCOS, achieved or reached some sort of strategic agreement with their Chinese interlocutors that this pipeline, with the Chinese company, the Chinese CNPC, that they should produce this pipeline to China, and UCOS would help in the financing. That was the first time when you had the prospect of major foreign activity by a Russian firm that had not been either cleared or that the government really disliked. In most of the cases before, the companies were using the kind of strategic advantage they had by partnering with former Soviet assets, so expanding in Eastern Europe, expanding in the Baltics, or trying to hold on to old Soviet-era contracts internationally. So we didn't even have a point of conflict. When we see what happens with that one point of conflict, it really created an unpleasant situation. But the UCOS case is important for something else, which was the reinterpretation of taxes. I mean, that it's not enough that you paid your taxes at a certain point, but the state demonstrated that it would go back, and it had the capacity to go back and review your payments and assess whether you had paid them fairly. And if they decided you had not met your tax obligation, then anything your company held at home or abroad was subject. And that has not been applied to foreigners yet, but the same model exists. So at this point, there is no grandfather, there's no legal protection that if you haven't paid for whatever number of years, that you cannot re-evaluate tax claims after X number of years. And everybody admits that the way these tax bills were paid in early years was very suspicious to be too strong, but most people found there were legal loopholes, there were illegal loopholes, and both were practiced, and different companies balanced the practice of legal and illegal loopholes differently.
I can think of one very good example where the Russian government very much behind investing abroad. Of course, that's in the West Cornfield in Iraq. 700,000 barrels per day peak. You don't walk away from that opportunity. And I suspect that the agreement that Russia made between that allowed to go forward between ConocoPhillips and Lukoil saw an advantage in having a link with an American company, given presumably the better standing of an American company in Iraq than a Russian company. We'll see how that one works out. But that's an investment opportunity which has been very much strongly pushed by the Russian government.